Hello, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Gretchen Rabinkin. I'm Executive Director of the Boston Society of Landscape Architects, the Massachusetts and Maine chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and I'm an architect and longtime member of the BSA. On behalf of the BSA, the BSLA, and the Aga Khan Council USA, I'm pleased to welcome you tonight. This evening's event is the second webinar in the series Architecture and Dialogue, a webinar series and digital exhibit organized by the BSA and the Aga Khan Council and co-sponsored by the BSLA and MIT Department of Architecture. We'll put a link to the online exhibit and the webinar series in the chat. Next slide. Tonight's theme is ecological resiliency and recovery. This is one of three dominant themes that emerged and which define the winners of the 2017-2019 cycle Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Next slide. Tonight, we'll hear about three projects in more detail, projects in Senegal, Bangladesh, and the UAE, as we explore issues of innovative sustainable design, the positive environmental legacy of buildings and landscapes, and how best practices from Aga Khan winners might be applied to our local context. The format this evening. After an overall introduction, we'll spend about 10 minutes on each project, and then we'll end with discussion and Q&A. Everyone, please submit questions via the chat anytime throughout the evening. They'll help shape the discussion at the end. And as you know, this webinar is being recorded. All registrants will receive a link to the recording, as well as instructions for LACES, if LACES applies to you. Tonight, a panel of esteemed Boston-based architects and landscape architects, educators, and advocates will lead our discussion. And we'll put links in the chat to longer bios. Professor James Wescoat, FASLA, will moderate tonight's session. Professor Wescoat is the Aga Khan Professor Emeritus of Landscape Architecture and Geography and the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT, and former co-director of the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. His extensive research has concentrated on water systems in South Asia and the US, from site to river basin scales. Jim, thanks so much for guiding us this evening. Jim will be joined by panelists Pallavi, Kalia, Mande, Sheila Kennedy, and Jessica Leete. Pallavi is founder and director of Tampraparni, a 2017 Harvard GSD Loeb Fellow. Pallavi is also the former director of Watershed Resilience for the Charles River Watershed Association, where she formulated the Blue Cities Initiative, promoting water-centric planning with the goal of restoring natural hydrology in our cities. Grounded in an understanding of watershed science and engineering, Pallavi advocates for environmental solutions that improve the quality of life for our communities while restoring the ecological health of our land and water resources. As founding principal of Kennedy and Village Architecture, KVA, Sheila Kennedy, FAIA, has established a new model for interdisciplinary design practice that explores architecture, digital technology, and emerging public needs, seeking to link possible realities with their potential to transform specific conditions of the present. Sheila is also professor of the practice of architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And landscape architect, sculptor, urban designer, and ecology educator Jessica Leete founded Boston Dash Studio to create a space for convergent thinking, design process, and construction to encourage regenerative solutions that reverse environmental degradation, are resilient, adaptable, and provide training for an empowered community. Jessica is also the instructor of ecology systems at the Boston Architectural College. Jim, Pallavi, Sheila, and Jessica, we look forward to listening and learning from all of you this evening.
Many thanks, Gretchen, and Taylor, if we can go to the next slide, that'd be great. Really like to thank the BSA and BSLA and the Aga Khan Council for organizing and supporting these webinars in the 14th cycle of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. It's worth emphasizing that this marks 40 years in the development of the award and also of the programs for Islamic architecture at MIT and Harvard. So you see on the left-hand side the original steering committee for the award for architecture in 1979, and then up to the current 2019 awards that have identified the 3 projects outlined in green that are going to be representative of the theme of ecological resilience and recovery. And it's worth saying a little bit more about the award, its origins and development as a prelude to the project case study. So let's go to the next slide, which has a quotation from His Highness the Aga Khan about architecture, very broadly defined to engage with all of the allied professions, building crafts, landscape architecture, urban design, infrastructure, engineering. One thing that stands out as you read this passage on the Aga Khan's vision of architecture is the emphasis placed on the built environment's role in helping to enhance and improve the quality of life. It's present in 3 of the sentences in this definition. Quality of life is the aim of the projects that are awarded this distinction. And that meaning of that term, quality of life, has evolved over time and is now emphasizing questions of resilience and recovery in the face of various kinds of stresses. Let's go to the next slide to see how this fits the award for architecture within the larger Aga Khan Development Network. There are 3 main branches of the network on economic development, social development, and cultural development. And the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, in that 3rd branch, includes the award for architecture, also the Aga Khan Museum, the Historic Cities Program, music program, and an education program. The Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture at MIT and Harvard are separate from the development network. And yet at the same time, we have very strong relationships with the Trust for Culture and the Award for Architecture over the past 4 decades, and also with branches of the social development network as well. The Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, for example, AKU, and the University of Central Asia also. So this network puts the Award for Architecture in a very broad context of development for human and environmental well-being. Next slide, please. And each cycle has yielded a major volume of essays as well as the premiated projects. And those essays by leading designers, by architectural historians and other scholars are really enormously valuable as a resource for folks in the professions and scholars as well. They're all available online for download, so that I'd encourage you to go to the Award for Architecture website and download any and all of these volumes. ArchNet, which is the documentation center at the MIT Library, also has them available. And they'd be part of anyone's library, hardback too, but they're available free online. Let's go to the next slide. Say a little bit more about the process and then the outcomes of this award over the past 4 decades. This map indicates the projects that have been selected or shortlisted over that period, including the 3 that we'll be emphasizing. And I'd like to just say a little bit about how the award works. The candidate projects that are first considered are those that are nominated by a network of nominators worldwide. This last cycle that included 380 nominations. The steering committee, chaired by His Highness the Aga Khan and some distinguished designers and scholars, offer guidance to a master jury. The guidance will ask for consideration of certain themes, resilience being one of them, and to help the jury when it's reviewing candidate projects. But the jury then is responsible for taking those nominated projects and shortlisting some 20 of them, in this case, for what would become a detailed on-site review. So the projects aren't selected without a field-based review that's very rigorous. You'll hear more about that in the 3 cases that we have, where not only does a distinguished architect designer go out and do the analysis in the field. They prepare a very long report and bring that back, present it, and discuss it with the jury in Geneva before finalists are finally selected. Let's go to the next slide. And each award ceremony occurs at some distinguished place of place of architectural distinction. In this past cycle, that was in Kazan, in Tatarstan, in Russia. And you might say, well, why Kazan? And this map of the 13th century travels of Ibn Battuta shows just how on the northern margins of the Islamic world, Kazan and the Bulgar capital was at that time. But for 1,000 years, this has been a contact zone for various Muslim and Russian societies, ethnic diversity of extraordinary complexity in the middle Volga River Valley. And if we go to the next slide, you'll get a sense of the imagery of a place where mosques and monasteries in the post-Soviet context are reopening. A large program of public space development in almost all cities of the Tatarstan Republic that themselves won an award this cycle. So it was an extraordinary place to consider the projects that were selected as finalists this year and to think of them in a larger regional and changing global context. I think these are some of the key points that I had in the way of an introduction to the award and to this cycle. In the next slide, I think we're going to shift over to Sheila Kennedy's thoughts on the Allioune Diop University lecture building. So Sheila, if you would.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you for this introduction. It's a pleasure to talk a little bit about the Allioune Diop University lecture building, as it's called, a building that was finished in 2017, and you can see the client group credits and the design and construction credits here on this slide. I wanted to just give a little bit of the context that the design team, both the contractors and designers, were working in. Bombay is a very rural region. This is one of the main approaches to the university there. And with the World Bank, the Ministry of Education in Senegal wanted to expand this university to 1,500 students and really allow the students to have access to education within walking distance of their villages. There is a real lack of shade in the area. There's a lack of basic sanitation and sewage as well, and really limited access for construction vehicles that would be, that we would think, in the Boston area at least, as being normal to construction. So this is part of the context that's important to remember. Next slide, please. And there are a few tree species. The technical report does tell us that there are acacia, baobab, some eucalyptus, and these become like public places for people to walk. And the architects report that they were struck by this. Next slide, please. The other thing that's important to mention is the extreme difficulty of the Sahel climate. In this part of Senegal, there's a very high seasonal rainfall. But the seasonal rainfall occurs around the months of July to September when it's extremely drought-ridden. So you have torrential rain and then you have these long periods of dry. Temperatures can get up to 45 degrees. Breezes are always hot and they're rare. And typically buildings want to be oriented in a north-south direction. Next slide, please. So in all of these very challenging circumstances, the architect team, which is a global consultancy, was asked to work with the World Bank and the client group in Senegal to produce what is essentially a large piece of infrastructure. So you can see this is not a tiny firm that was involved. EDOM is a very large global consultancy. Next slide, please. And I think it's interesting to take a look. Here's a hospital project that they did. And if you advance, please, to the next slide. You'll see this is one of their university projects. From their vantage point, working all around the world and in very dry arid areas of Spain, they do have a kind of formal penchant for these very bold, very simple buildings that are a lot like infrastructure. Next slide, please. And that is in fact the case. It was a little shocking at first to think that this very large building, number 9, could be built in this very small campus. But I believe what the design team is trying to do is leverage infrastructural qualities of modularity and repetition and low cost into a very bold statement that can have the scale commensurate to the expansion of this training piece of the university. Next slide, please. So the building's dimensions are imposing. It's 203 meters long by 25 meters wide. And there on the north, there's this very large overhang. And you can see the plantings there. So this is citronella plant, which will freshen the air. And they are actually producing wind passively with this building orientation, just accelerating a wind from south to north, as we'll see. Next slide, please. So the east and west sides are relatively mural. The project is animated only by a ramp, an accessibility ramp, and the stair that you can see here. Next slide. And it has this very kind of strong, simple, repetitive impact at night, where all of the elements can be repeated from point of ease of construction. Next slide. This is the plan, and I'd like you to notice a couple of things really quickly. The section, which shows the way in which the hot air is driven through the building, and the building has a double roof system, which we'll see. It also has a double wall system, which we can see here in this plan, so that there are actually these ambient layers that get cooler and cooler as one begins to occupy the large lecture rooms and classrooms that are part of this complex. And since there was no sanitation treatment, the architects developed a large, what they call a meander, which has rainwater, which is caught from the roof, directed to a filtration raft system, which you can see here in plan, and then refiltered and left deliberately to have only water for native plants. Absolutely no non-native plants were used with their non-native water demands. Next slide. Just a couple of classroom pictures here. I'm interested in this kind of vegetable fiber mat, which they used on the ceilings and walls. This is one of the large lecture rooms, and you can see how basic architectural elements like color and materiality are used. Next slide. In this classroom that you see here, the vegetable mats are in the ceiling. And you're looking through a screen of breeze blocks, which we'll talk about in a minute. Next slide, please. And then this is the double roof system. There is the roof that we just saw of the classrooms, which is heavily insulated. And then there's a shield with this steel and corrugated metal, like a heat shield, if you will, that shades the building and prevents some of the solar heat gain. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk a little bit about the breeze blocks, which you can see here on the left in the facade. And this gives you a sense too of the kind of arid season in the area that is dry now because there is no water coming off the roof. Next slide. This is a pretty incredible detail. It's a mold system with inserts. So it's what we call a flexible mold. And this was used to create breeze blocks, which was a vernacular idiom that allows wind and light to come through a wall. These breeze blocks, there were 20,000 of them, were made out of locally produced concrete that was actually came from Dakar. And these flexible blocks allow one mold to have different shapes. Next, please. So this produced quite a lot of labor and trained people on site. You see some of the breeze blocks being assembled here. They were air dried, so that was very efficient, no kiln. Next slide, please. And here you can see them being installed and they would be mudded in place. So this is a corner detail. And really they're getting a pretty amazing quality of finish. So again, very infrastructural, taking one type of block with only one variant at the corner and really trying to make an entire kind of university statement with this. Next slide, please. So you can see the inside of that. It's held off, these blocks, concrete blocks are held off with these steel columns and truss system to the second wall of enclosure, the second thermal wall, and you have this long corridor on the inside. And on the other side, you can see the waste treatment rafts and the plantings that are sponsored there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what this might mean for us closer to home. Next slide, please. And think a little bit about how past is future. We can be pretty sure that extreme climate is going to be something that's going to start driving our projects everywhere in the world, including here at home. It's very interesting to think about how modules of construction can be reinvented and how there are opportunities to engage local materials even right here close to home. Next slide. So Jim had invited us to kind of talk a little bit about how some of these exemplary projects are reflected here in our local context. And this is one project where we worked with local workers as well. Next slide, please. A project that's, I think it's been up for a couple of Harleston Parker Awards at the BSA. It's across the river. I live in Boston, so it's across the river on Harvard University. And the brickwork is a combination of extreme craft and also digital brick. Next slide, please. So sometimes we think in the so-called developing world, that's the place where the architect needs to kind of collaborate with workers. But actually, we worked with our union bricklayers and masons, a great crew, and we could not have built this project without it. Next slide, please. You can see some of the dry stacking. You can go to the next slide quickly. And some of the work that we did with 3D modeling. So we used some advanced software together with the know-how and the hand-based craft of our local masons. Next slide. To put together this project. Next slide. So I think we're going to see much more of that. And then one more. And I'll just end with this slide. Again, past is future. I think there's a lot of opportunity to combine high and low tech with building industry innovation. I think the Allioune project really demonstrates that. And I think there's really interesting opportunities that I hope we can discuss in the question and answers portion of this webinar around how universities and professionals and government agencies and development organization networks can work together to kind of accelerate this next generation of innovation. So I hope we can talk more about that later. I'll turn it over to our next presenter.
Hi, everyone. As was introduced, I have the honor to talk about this project, Arcadia Education Project in Bangladesh. And one thing that I wanted to connect back to what Sheila was talking about, each of these projects have been really capitalizing on where they are situated in terms of the landscape, but also very much looking to vernacular architecture, whether it's materials or the labor that goes into the craft of building. And I'd like to go to a video that shows the vision of the project. And after this, we can talk a little bit about the different aspects that I mentioned.
First came and I saw only water, and I just told, I don't see any land, and where do I build? And she said that, well, that's it, this is what I have bought. I observed the way people built with bamboo here. And in some places, I have used exactly the material they would be using in their traditional houses. I said that, no, I'm not going to innovate everything here. So my innovation is that how to have a platform that floats and that settles on the ground.
It is a riverine country, Bangladesh, and it has got a lot of people's house, they get drowned during the monsoon period. And they can come to a school, like if they built a floating school, it is a floating in summer, and it is in the summer month, it is not a floating anymore, and it is on the dry land.
But we had to improvise. There are, of course, very sophisticated way of doing it, but it required a lot of engineering and a lot of money. And I thought that why don't we do something very basic, which can be a learning experience also. So this particular place opens up the children's imagination to the experience of nature, and learning from nature, I think, is very important when you grow up as a child. And I also saw that even places not having much openings, not having much light inside. So I thought that if I could make something very light and innovation, the children can look into it and they can have something going in their mind that, oh, this is interesting. The way things are being predicted, we are going to experience a big change in our landscape, in our environment. Water is one of them. So we must devise a strategy for that future. I'm not saying that we have a solution here, but what I'm saying that we have a thinking that is been initiated, that yes, let's find out how we can develop a response to that condition.
So I'm going to start to talk about the project. Essentially, you heard the architect, Saiful Haq, talk about how he really wanted to have this building sit on the landscape in a way that it would not only showcase what the landscape looks like, but very much allow for it to function the way it needs to. So this, to me, would be a great example of having a building that lives with water. And I know we've been in the context here talking about that with climate change, especially coastal cities like Boston are really thinking hard and long about how do you have architecture respond to what we're seeing with climate change in terms of materiality, way of building. But what I find really inspirational about this project is how it really connects with the community that it caters to. So the building material, as the architect said, and the skill, the craftsmanship that comes with having local craftsmen work on this is exemplary. I would like you to notice how the building is being built, and it's one thing to for us architects to talk about construction documentation and making all the details be as specific and accurate as possible. But as you can see, there's a lot of improvisation that goes on to this at the site itself, and that to me is also something that adds to the beauty of this building. It is simple, very basic in terms of using the local bamboo materials, having those ties which hold those together. And because it's an amphibious building, there is a lot of room for it to move based on how it's being affected by the floods. I'll just talk a little bit about how this project was really exemplifying, in a country like Bangladesh. The architect was really very determined to not make this be a sort of a heavy object in space. It was really his vision to have it be with the landscape as much as possible. There you see Razia Alam, who's actually the owner and the client, who was very determined to have the site be transformed into a school. And I think the vision that she put together with the architect really resonated with how it came together for both the educational purposes for the kids who are coming to school here, but also connecting back to the community of residents and builders who actually came to this from their own knowledge of place and material. This is the condition where it's flooded, and the architect was very much enamored by having the children kind of watch how the different landscape or the time lapse between when this building is flooded versus when it's stationary actually can create sort of an educational moment for them. So it's almost like the kids are exposed to an outdoor lab where it's not the movement of water, land, vegetation is very temporal. And that's what kind of brings you back to how an architect is not only respecting the local landscape of the site, but having a very light touch when it comes to how the landscape either needs to be modified or accentuated by the way the building meets the land. As you can see, it's pretty far from the river that you can see on the left top side, but the way the details were put together, it really functioned in every situation, no matter how high the flood level might be, it just floated on top of the water. And the architect thinks that's really what can contribute to the learning of the children there and open their own minds to creative thinking and understanding how buildings and environment connect with each other. Here you can see it under construction. These are the details that the architect was able to kind of design that made the basic materials like bamboo and what he used for flotation. It was all materials that are coming from the local area. Nothing is coming from outside of Bangladesh. And the idea is that it actually responds to the climate in a way that you can see the different materials turning and aging and becoming more a part of the site with time. Text talks a lot about how it's important for him to have these children who come to the school actually learn from the building and how it moves and adapts to the landscape. And as you can see, this is pretty early in terms of how young these children are. And it's his experience that this actually really helped them think creatively about space, about the relationship of building to nature, about how they can actually improvise with space in their play and other activities. And it's really something that I feel can be learned from this environment where the client is almost these kids for whom these spaces have been designed to kind of cater to what they can connect to, both in terms of learning happening in this space, but also how they are occupying the space for different functions, whether it's studying, playing. As you saw before, there is a ton of creativity being put in together. So hopefully you can appreciate how the spaces have been put together. So what I'll leave you with is really a lesson in creating a respect for nature as a paradigm, and using the landscape as infrastructure. And if you take nothing but this, I think from both an architectural point of view, as well as urban design, I think it's really critical for an architect or somebody who's shaping the built environment to understand how landscape functions, and if and when you actually mold the space, if you can actually incorporate the landscape functionality in that, that's probably the best lesson learned here. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Pallavi. The Wasit Wetland Center is one of many initiatives that Sarja's Environmental and Protected Area Authority, they go by EPAA, have undergone. The EPAA really set out to, they as a client set out to see it as an opportunity for education and engagement with a natural setting right in the city of Sarja. So, and it is now home to, I guess, the focus has been on birds, bird sanctuary, essentially. There is now home to over 350 non-migratory birds, and it's literally, the eastern, or rather the coast of the United Arab Emirates is a flyway. So there's over, they counted, there's 33,000 migrating birds that actually use the site in migration as well. And it has just so beautifully settled into the landscape. I think this is one of the really profound things about the architectural moves in this project. It's very much one of those sort of, you might call it a landscape building, but even you can see a bit of the site here moving back, where there's mention of paths and things that are accessed around the edge, but there's a video for this as well.
We came 5 years ago to this site, and the client asked us to really give them recommendation rather than putting it in the peripheries and putting it in a place that is strategically we could camouflage the whole building with the site so it can be comfortable both for people and also for the birds.
The site here, it used to be a kind of a wastewater and the garbage dump area. Government of Sharjah started to purify the site some times ago from the garbage, where they started to almost replace the I would say native plants gradually with the native plants. And therefore, the area started to attract many local and migrant birds. Well, I think in this project, we are looking at a complete kind of an environmental kind of protection, and how the, I would say, architecture and the nature, they come together in a very harmony.
I think we need to always question what architecture is and what it does.
For Wasit Wetland Center, Hana Saif Al-Suwaidi, Paul Vilkanen, Ahmed Al-Ali, Farid Ismail.
So this internal area, you see where the pieces of canopy are creating some shade. I think this is the zone where primarily the non-migratory birds are kept, and then the area towards the left of the screen there is more of an open wetland where the migratory birds are able to land. And I think this is, more the sort of managed, and then it extends into a larger portion of the site. So by setting the building down into the ground too, up to your knees, almost 3 feet, they have literally kind of changed the relationship of ground to architecture. You see here a lot of some of the internal areas for birds. So it is kind of a zoo setting, but they worked with, in terms of sustainability, I mean, it is like one of those patches where you find a whole plethora of native species available, particularly designed around habitat. And there's a zoologist, Paul Verkeman. He's working with the Breeding Center for Endangered Arabian Wildlife. So it's very much a very intentionally, very, I think, scientific based in terms of building a habitat and selecting native species for that purpose. So in addition, the cooling that this causes too, to sink the building in the ground makes so much sense for this climate, obviously. And then the idea is to be viewing, so they've used glass on almost all sides, but they actually slanted it out so that there's a reflection on the outside and not on the inside. So basically birds can't see in, but we can see out. And then using that long overhang, and even the way the detailing in the roof and the way the airflow is working, both in terms of shade and just in general, a very simple use of architecture, building methods. Next slide, please. You see the simple program they use with just these 3 bar components, and was really interested to see, just looking back on Google Earth, they really responded to existing conditions on the site and making some of these big moves. So what the architect was saying in that video introduction, I really think is true. They really went to the site and responded to the place. Next slide, please. For me to talk about something in terms of ecology and particularly sustainability or resilience, I really only think of it in terms of a system. But the notion of this being one patch of potentially a series of systems, I was quite intrigued. I still couldn't exactly find which other wetlands they're interested in restoring. The site, it was marked here, but it came off. I think it's here actually, this half. And on the other side, there's a different, it's like maybe a shooting range and golf clubs or something, but other program, the historic wetlands I could find on Google Earth, there was a line that was, it's actually much of the city, it's all now urban fabric. So that's all been built. But so next slide, please. Again, I just wanted to share more images of how it's, they've done just a really amazing job of, I think, integrating the architecture and the natural setting in terms of making it an educational opportunity, even just in terms of the viewing experience and in terms of the habitat experience. It's in terms of it's a managed system. It's not like a totally natural functioning system, though it looks fairly natural. And for me, that line it can be somewhat tenuous, but they've done really, I think, an amazing job here, as you can see. Next slide, please. And just to have the different kinds of experiences of engagement in the context of an urban fabric. So it sounds like, next slide, please. Not many visitors have come, local visitors have come from the area, but many are using it as a kind of a destination to go around the edge, and there's a path that moves around the edge of the much larger site. And they've done, again, a beautiful job in different instances of really using the architecture to try to mediate the environment. The image on the left is still, it's one of many of the programmed areas they included, using simple cooling techniques. And then the image on the right is an image of the path. It's like a golf. They provide a path that you can take golf carts around, and these different stands to sit in and view birds that actually, they use a cross, an alternate cross paneling in order to allow cross breezes through, but still provide shade from above. Next slide, please. And just to put it in context, I think of the mission of the Aga Khan to address the value of ecological sustainability, I just wanted to share with you these few images of the Wadi Hanifa wetlands in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. They were part of the 2010 awards. Check them out on the website and resources that Jim was mentioning in the beginning. This is an amazing project, amazing at scale, but also in terms of what it's doing in terms of providing obvious habitat, both in terms of industrial use and migratory birds, as you can see on the right. And then on the bottom, this is actually flood control, but then obviously allowing for social engagement as well. And this notion, again, of this single units maybe that in and of themselves don't look so as much of a, we can't read them as ecological per se or sustainable even, but then in this kind of idea of supporting and really celebrating this opportunity for a systemic approach, particularly in the urban context, I find quite exciting. So in the series of these awards building, I think there's a lot to be said. Next slide, please. And then just a couple images from my work, there's kind of two extremes of how we can take this idea of ecology or science in the landscape. And this one, it was just a competition for the Gowanus Canal, which is a Superfund site according to the EPA. But do you place your project in the middle of all these existing efforts and existing design developments and infrastructural moves, and consider the moves that you make at almost like this successional development of different types of intervention and types of remediation, and that there's this simultaneous access that's required. So we're looking at, social and the built being as much part of the ecological as the abiotic and the biotic. Next slide, please. And this might imply more of like an embedded nature of technology. And one that, there's a lot of, how far do we get in this direction where, with the smart city and the integration of blue-green technology into all levels of city infrastructure, and where does that shift to more of an open source hardware and data effort, so it's not so controlled by a few, but more accessed by many and engaged in by many. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a project where there's actually it's a few small moves. This was a project done with Aga Group in China. They're based in Shanghai, and Xiaowei Mao. I was one of the design principals on this project with him. This is a vanishing edge, that the grading move is such a simple move. I think similarly to the Wasit wetland, the simple move of a grade change in the water. So this is actually a 5-kilometer stream that's coming down. I won't say that the water management is particularly, it could be better if ecologically. I mean, a lot could have been done to just improve the health of the water. I think that's just not necessarily the priority in this context. It's a post-industrial use actually, but the main issue was at the temperature initially. But it's moving down a long channel that's part of like a new city development. And this simple grading decision, and next slide, please, of creating a grade change of a few meters. There is a seasonal grade change. The water body beyond is a water reservoir. But creating this grade change, it both allowed for aeration of the water and allowing people access down to the next layer, and created the vanishing edge effect, and thus kind of, I think, like the Wasit wetland, that experience of awe in relation to architecture with the landscape. And next slide, please. And so I really question sometimes in the notion of sustainability, maybe removing ecological to the point, except for the social end, to what, I do think that, the cultivation of this really non-complacent bonding to nature is really essential to developing a really mature environmental ethic or any idea of true sustainability. So, thank you.
Then I'd like to invite our speakers just to, having seen the 3 projects and thinking a little bit about comparability across, I mean, there's such profoundly different contexts. So a subtropical arid environment, a humid tropical deltaic environment, and an arid coastal environment. And one would think that it would be difficult to perhaps make comparisons across such profoundly different cases, but were there points of either comparison or contrast that struck you when hearing them? Say, maybe starting with Sheila, you'd like to share.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think that the project, the Allioune project, was initially challenging because it's such an extruded infrastructural project that's done like a piece of infrastructure at very low cost with a lot of repetition. So it challenges some ideas of resilience that we might have inherited, that, it's very close to the land, it's made out of all land materials, it relates to nature. And I think that what is interesting at the end for me is the scale of the project, and the fact that it starts to point to, inspire further work with local materials. These breeze blocks and this structure is concrete, and there's some lightweight steel. There's a huge revival going on in Dakar right now with earthen architecture and earth block. I really feel like a project like this could inspire the local architects to submit tenders and to utilize some ancient techniques that are being revived now in Dakar. So the scale of this project is very challenging in an area that has a lot of extreme climate challenges and resource challenges. And I believe that we will all be confronting these same kind of challenges, regardless of the scale of our projects. How do we tap into local labor wherever we find that labor? And I would argue that it's not just in the picturesque so-called developing world, but it can be here at home. And how can we construct accelerators so that local builders can have a force factor that allows them to do their work more easily and more quickly so that more local materials can be used. I'll leave that reflection right there. But
oh, that's great. And I wondered also about the whole stormwater in an area of such extreme climate variability. You know, how much one can rely upon the stormwater system to produce a vegetation cover that would have the functions. I think they have it, so it's not dependent upon that. But if it were to develop,
no, it's really a percolation system. If I understand the report correctly, there's some vegetation treatment in a plant that also has a screen, a breeze screen brick wall around it, but it is not a bioremediation. So that's why you see that very arid landscape in the dry season. Yeah, right there. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you. And Pallavi, how about your thoughts, since you had I think some that went beyond the video. Would you care to?
Sure. No, I just to add to what Sheila said, I think all the projects do pay a lot of attention to how they respond to either the immediate environment in terms of the arid or more coastal attributes, and I think they successfully connect the inside and the outside in ways that the architecture responds to the site as well as the landscape in terms of functionality. The thing that I see maybe slightly different is how the project might sort of connect with ideology of making it an educational feature. I think there's different degrees of what about the project speaks to an architect versus somebody who's a user of space, and I think that's translated very differently in the three projects, and I think each of them does a very good job of doing that, but in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was, I think, one aspect of the project that was also that the architect attended to was the question of waste management during wet weather conditions. And so you have, during a flood event, how are some of the sanitary waste and in particular going to be managed? And the way that they did that could very well have relevance for some of the areas, say, that we've been reading about in the United States that have such poor drainage and waste disposal. I'm thinking of parts of Alabama, Mississippi, where this has been highlighted as a severe problem. So this type of solution, one might be able to find applications in contexts within the US as well. I guess the question that came to mind for me is, for what types of flood events is this system resilient? I can imagine for the single year, the multi-year flood event, but for a major storm in Bangladesh, it seems to me it would need to be coupled with some of the evacuation cyclone shelters, for which Bangladesh is also renowned. So they have both strategies for more extreme events.
The other way to look at it would be just that it is allowed to blow away because it's made completely out of local bamboo. So it can be reconstructed and you can re-extend the educational experience to that next generation of students.
Yeah, I was going to say, in some ways, the resilience of the services or the utilities is a interesting issue, because in the West, in say the context of Boston, we are very quickly realizing that, you know, centralizing our wastewater treatment or stormwater does make us more vulnerable to, as a city, if something happens to Deer Island, a lot of the city is going to be affected by it. So I think one of the virtues that I see is how you can keep the impact of the building and the use very local. So it's not really dependent on, you know, a utility that's far from where the building is to function if in adverse conditions.
And Jessica, thinking across cases, what sorts of further reflections might you have?
Well, going back to what Sheila was saying about the university there, I think too, with the scale and the modularity that they created, that is just, I really identify with the potential of that in kind of looking at alternative methods or more engaged methods of construction, and kind of an idea of it is part more of a continuum of construction with the landscape. Coming from landscape, we see, you know, it is transient, it's constant change, there's constant evolution, and it's not complete for 100 years plus. So this constant evolution notion is so inherent in landscape. But again, to bring it more into the notion of including the material of the built world, that is our ecology, and the social behavior and you know, the way we engage and relate to nature, that is the ecology, in addition to the abiotic and biotic conditions. Again, I think this site, because it is sort of really set up to be an engagement opportunity in an area that doesn't have a lot of green space, where this model of kind of an internal landscape is very culturally relevant, and it just makes sense in terms of comfort, human living. So I think it really kind of celebrates so many things that are inherently valued in the culture and of this place and of this land even. So that kind of process, I think, is you know, really critical to what we do, just in communicating value. But you know, it does have, I'm sure, the research value in terms of those local species, endangered local species, and what the zoologist is doing. All the planting was done by the zoologist. So you know, it's again very much around habitat and the necessary seed sources for bird food and whatnot. And this idea of, you know, protecting the seed source, that's also, I think, something that we need to be reminded of. And they mentioned they used kind of an invasive species around the edge. Well, a species that's not often used. And I don't know if it's considered invasive in this area or not. I couldn't find enough research on it, but it's in the family of a certain type of red mangrove. And, you know, the mangrove ecoregion is along many of the coasts, kind of throughout the tropics, and it's endangered all over the world. But this species that they've used here, they've used it around the buffer, as you mentioned in the video, for the wall. And it also, though, is picking up heavy metals, I imagine, as they leach out through, because it was historically this dump. And to like the extent of that, I couldn't really find data on, but I imagine it will be, you know, kind of ongoing more as part of the habitat. But again, this could be replicated at the urban scale and repeated. I think too, you know, the focus to attend and visit, it is money to go in. So there may be options. I've seen in Taiwan where they allowed an amusement park access with the T-Pass, you know, and one day a week, the local T-Pass would get you in. So something like that, where you allow local people in basically just for being a resident, I think would make total sense. And also, yeah, I mean, again, just tying it to people's lives, tying it more directly to people's lives, I think is really the critical component. So
these projects can make an enormous difference in that respect, and then the scaling and replication and oftentimes does happen. We have great questions in the chat, and I'm trying to remember if it's Gretchen who's moderating those questions for us, or to pose them, or how would you like to pick up on some of the audience questions?
Jim, I'd say however you'd like to do it. I'm just copying over the questions from the Q&A so that they're all here together for you.
Okay.
But as moderator, you have,
Okay.
you may steer this however you like.
Well, I can just jump in on the Allioune. I think that this is a community of really small villagers for the most part, cattle herders, peanut farmers. And their practice, and they have very small mud-built huts, sometimes with corrugated roofs, sometimes circular, sometimes rectangular. So this is a much larger structure. And I think part of the value was to give the impression that they were really attending a university of the scale you would find in the city without having to leave the city, because this is for the Ministry of Education and the World Bank. This is very much about keeping people, not forcing young people to leave their villages to seek education. Interestingly, the Ministry of Education requested that air conditioning units be placed only in the faculty offices. And the faculty do not use them, actually, because the temperature is, I think, doesn't go above, is it 28 degrees on the interior, even in the hottest days. So that's a real shift in ecological values, whereas before they were following a more Western idea of you had to have air conditioning in order to be urban, be sophisticated, be in a technical university. And now they are able to take their classes and be comfortable even in the hottest of days.
Mm-hmm. You know, this ties in nicely with one of the questions that Alicia has posed, saying that all three projects have a strong element of public education and advocacy with local communities, and asked if that was part of the award criteria. And in terms of that theme of quality of life for all those who are affected, it very much is. And the subtitle for the volume, Architecture and Dialogue, is Architecture for the Public Good in this cycle. And that really comes across in the three projects in very different ways, but satisfied in very, very high degree, it would seem. We have some specific questions as well for how would you compare this prize with the Aga Khan Award with the Pritzker Prize? And for architect friends, Sheila and Pallavi, you're very familiar with Pritzker, and it's a very different type of award, wouldn't you say?
I do think it's a different kind of an award. I think that the Pritzker has been trying to be more attentive to all of the different nations that have architects, which are many. But ultimately, it's a small group of people who are given a certain charge in the award, a charge about global influence. That's essentially one of the main criteria for the Pritzker, which can be translated with the influence of the buildings themselves and also the influence that the architect has had on education, on students, and on impact. So I think that what's interesting with the Aga Khan Awards is that this impact may be forthcoming. There may be a delay, so to speak, in transmission between the projects that we're seeing and the impact they are having and will have on us all over the planet. The Allioune University, for example, is perhaps not as charming as what we might think of, natural systems, wildlife, charismatic plant infrastructure and architecture. And it is like Edom's kind of brutalist large architecture. But the way that they've handled climate in this building with the double skins and the double walls really has, I think, allowed this university to be where it is, sited where it is. So it has really contributed to human comfort. And what I'm trying to express is that in the next 10 or 20 years, with the heating of the United States and the drought that is already here and present, particularly this year and last in the Sierras, we are going to need to consider building like this. So there's a delay between the impact that potentially this uncharismatic building at first glance might seem to have on how we build.
I just wanted to, sorry, Jim, just a quick add on to what Sheila said. I think most of these projects, if not all, really truly expand the definition, if you will, of architecture. It's not just talking about building, but landscapes, a sense of place. And we talked about this when we had discussed these projects earlier, that the boundaries, if you will, of architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design kind of get a lot more blurred. And it really does speak to creation of space, but mostly it's about responding to context, which I think is really done in a very articulated manner.
Yeah, it's a really good point on how you can have a comparability across hyper-contextualized types of design that in their own ways have some commonality and breadth of significance, notwithstanding a highly locally sensitive type of design. Question was raised about how does the panel think about the relationship between this theme of resilience and other notions of sustainability? Is the resilience theme always fully developed as you would like, or would you like more information on that front?
I have information that's in the very thorough technical report that's freely shared and available to the public on the link. But I think that one can ask for more. I think, there's a the report tells us that there's a 41% surcharge for all materials that are imported into Senegal because of the maritime shipping. And a number of these materials, including the raw concrete that's prepped in Dakar, came from abroad. So if the World Bank could tap into the entrepreneurs, for example, there's a company called Élémentaire in Dakar, just outside of Dakar, that's fabricating thousands of earthen brick. If we could replace the concrete, even in the screen, with earthen bricks, I think there would be a real opportunity to increase the resiliency and lower the costs and improve the kind of ecological. Yeah, that's his factory. Yes.
Great.
This is Diop, who's an entrepreneur along with several architects and civil engineers in Dakar, who are really promoting this ancient form of building. And somehow or another, the question is, how can large entities like the Ministry of Education and the World Bank, who may look to architects and landscape architects abroad, how can they identify in their own country the studios like Studio Warofila here that are doing this kind of work?
If I may, again, just a quick note. I think one of the issues that we didn't talk enough about, but maybe Jessica touched on, was each project, besides the form, the design, the materiality, but it speaks to the resilience of the community, if you will. And I think, at least in Bangladesh, for those of you who know how frequently the flooding condition prevails, and it's really the resilience of the citizens or the community occupying space there that kind of understand that they have to kind of work with nature, if you will, on a temporal basis, but also be able to use the resources that nature provides to create habitat. And it's the social sustainability or the social resilience, which is also very directly tied to resilience as we understand from an architectural standpoint.
And Jessica, your thoughts on, if you were kind of looking for more, what would you want to ask the
more, yeah, absolutely more the integration into the existing systems. Like, where is the water coming from for the site? I know they're recycling some from the roof, but kind of the historic wetland system and how it could link to a larger series of wetlands, I don't think anything is sustainable in isolation, and the notion of resilience is, it doesn't make sense. Someone had asked the question too, if this was abandoned, would it survive? And I think it would, because it's native species, they're all adapted to really low water use and whatnot. You know, they're being given, it's like a natural area where there's some extra water, the way they've designed this. But you know, for me, it's really understanding more about the detail, the construction detail, and how they have really used local planting and local material to be part of this continuum that can just kind of be regenerative and regenerate itself. But then again, how it can connect to more infrastructural systems in this context, like in the city. I think those opportunities with like the blue-green city and really integrating abiotic and water into, you know, not just an even blanket of, you know, homogeneous concrete, but that heterogeneous, uneven, some built, some green, some water, getting them more of that unevenness and more systemic approach. So for me, it's really understanding a project within at least the watershed. I can't approach a project and think about its ecology without understanding at least at the watershed scale. So that is
great. Okay, well, these are great questions that we can carry forward. And if we go to the very last slide, some of the questions that audience has posed, how would we find out, get more information? And some of the preparatory materials we had were drawn from the Aga Khan Award for Architecture website, which has a lot of documents, but there are some that are on the ArchNet website, which is hosted at the MIT Roach Library, and the links are shown here. And each project has the technical report, images, videos, and additional background documents for every project, so that for people who want to study these design exemplars in detail and really be able to use them to advance the state of the practice, these two sources is what we might be able to recommend most fully. I think Gretchen also has some additional suggestions. We've got the digital collection of the Award for Architecture that Pallavi has also posted for us. I think that's what we had amongst our panel, but Gretchen, would you like to, or Pallavi, have some closing comments for us?
I'd love to. Jessica, Sheila, Pallavi, and Jim, thank you for this discussion. And audience, thank you for your questions, prompts, and insights. I'd also like to recognize Polly Carpenter and Taylor Johnson's staff at the BSA, as well as Alicia Alani and Kalia Purani, volunteers with the Aga Khan Award program, who have all worked behind the scenes to make this evening happen. The recording will be available in the next few days and emailed to all registrants, along with LACES credit info, if LACES applies to you. A link to the virtual exhibit, as well as to the series in the video archive, are in the chat, as Jim was just saying. And we hope we'll see you at the next webinar. The next one in this series is called The Thriving and Inclusive Commons. Until then, health and well wishes to you all. Thank you.
Thank you all.